I am grateful to my wife's lover for renewing our feelings. At one time, Socrates said to me, "Get married by all means. If you get a good wife, you'll be happy. A bad one, you become a philosopher." That Munchausen. I alas did not become a philosopher, but I began to think about women much more deeply. Figured out my wife purely by accident. I was just kidding, saying I knew everything because I followed her. I saw how she got into a waiting car with an unknown man and not the subway. And what did I need it for? It was the 7th year of married life. It was my son's birthday, 5 years old, and suddenly this happened. There was thunder. Everything went upside down. And it all started her another trip to a friend and classmate, Julia, who lived somewhere out of town. She came back a day later, tired, with circles under her eyes, with a slight smell of booze. I could see that the girls had a good time after my joke. Her reaction to what I said shocked me. She collapsed in her chair, her legs buckled. She became increasingly pale, shook, tears began to flow. After I had managed to control myself, I started to twist her around in cold blood. "Well, how long have you been doing it with him?" The bitterness of resentment in my throat distorted my words and sounds beyond recognition, and I spoke as if in a cave. She was silent for a long time, as if not hearing me, withdrawn, then whispered aloofly, 5 years. "Who is he?" And silence again in response. I didn't torture her any further, but connected in parallel on the landing below the floor to a telephone receiver, just 2 wires, taking turns pressing against the common bus. I found my home phone. Back then, we didn't have cell phones, and a landline was the only available means of communication. It was 1998. She called her grandmother. As it turned out, she was an intermediary and was aware of her hobby. Through her they made arrangements for meetings. Listening to the conversation, I learned his name, Saryosha. Heard, B.A. Tell Sarahosia not to look for me and not to call. I myself will tell him everything. I returned to the apartment with an unfamiliar feeling. It ignored and burned everything from the inside, stabbing and piercing every point in my body. I remember that my teeth chatted and my cheekbones twisted, but I was in control. Maybe because I hadn't seen any of this and hoped for a joke, an untruth. I thought that now we'll talk to her and everything will be clarified and get on their usual family ways, but saw me. She immediately began to babble on and on, with a faint calm. They say it was something stupid and not worth attention. Nonsense, and will no longer be so a mistake. But then she burst into tears again, seeing my distorted face. Taking the icon with which we were married, she knelt in the middle of the room. But I said, "Call your Sarahosia, we will talk at the round family table. I know all about him." She staggered again as from an electric shock, and I took the punt again. For I did not know who this man was. "You know he's at work right now. Where do I call?" "That's okay. Get him on the phone. Invite him over for the evening." I played along again. And then it hit me, no, finished conjecture. It's Saryoga, my colleague, and friend, because I myself had invited him once to visit about 5 years ago, and we have always been happy to him. Treated as family, so dear that the wife began to share. Just like that, overnight, I lost my friend and most likely my wife. And he is also married with 2 children. Well, Sarajaga, good job. So that's why they had such a frightened guilty look 3 to 4 years ago when I returned one day before usual and ran into him and his wife at the door of his apartment. They were just coming out. If I had come back half an hour earlier, I probably would have been in jail, or maybe I would have been acquitted. If I had caught them in the crib in the famous poses, enjoying sex, he came over. He brought a bottle of vodka and put it on the table. He did not take off his jacket, which was quite understandable, for he was a fan of all the fancy gas piss at the moment and was as full of them as rimboard. They were obviously cramping his pockets. So he was afraid. They sat down at the table, empty this time. No service, only a bottle of vodka in the middle. "Do you like it?" I nod towards my spouse, who was standing a bit away. "Yes," I answered with a nod rather than a sound. "And what about you?" I asked without looking at my wife. "I love him." With a sassy note, she answered. "Call your wife and call her here." I handed the phone to Sergey, but Sergey shook his head. "Not ready," he said. And understandably, where would he live then? Surely, his wife would kick him out of his apartment in his village. In the Voloda region, the silence lingered. His refusal to call his wife clearly showed the level of relationship they were bound. The boy was clearly having fun. Why? Convenient. And a permanent alibi, because family friend when I want, then I come. I was not yet fully aware of all the tragedy of what had happened. I was not deeply aware of the tragedy. No decision had been made yet. Hate for him and for her was not going to settle in my head. I simply said to him, "Get out of here. I hope I never meet you again in this life." Sari Oya mumbled something to me as he was leaving. "I think no. We'll meet again," and he cried, covered his eyes with his jacket sleeve and went out the door. It's been 20 years, and we still haven't met, haven't seen each other. He's gone. And you? What are you sitting? Run, catch up with him. I will not live with you anyway. I sat motionless for a minute, then rushed after. Yes. She was gone for the first time in my life. In those minutes, I was truly alone. The minutes of reflection passed, and for me, it was years, the very years that were so easily thrown away, who raised from life. 7 years flashed before my eyes, like in an accelerated video. Here was the wedding. Congratulations. Wishes for family happiness. Here was her grandmother giving the bride a bouquet of white roses and kissing me on the cheek with the words, "Take care of her." Yes. The same one who had mediated 2 honeymoon years when we just enjoyed our youth and our bodies, a funny and huge 9-month-old belly, a sniffling little bundle tied with a blue bow in my arms. And we drove him in a rom the hospital. A year later, Sergey came into my life. I, myself, went and first spoke to the reticent newcomer to work, helped him get settled in a new place, and learning that he was forced to huddle at the crazy old woman in a remote side the city offered him to live in my empty apartment. We were living with my mother-in-law at the time, who was helping my wife at first with the baby. So I invited him to my birthday party. We became fast friends. It turned out we also served in the same military unit. I was 2 years older than him. He brought fruits and vegetables from his village, often walked with the stroller and helped his wife carry it. He was ready to fulfill any request, to go anywhere to take or bring what was needed. A dependable guy. 10 or 15 minutes later, my wife came back, didn't catch up or didn't want to. I don't know. I kept thinking hard. So when did you make it? I kept rewinding and rewinding the tape of life and did not find an answer. It turns out that in that first summer, when I went to visit my relatives in another city, and they continued to walk the stroller together and somewhere on the outskirts of our neighborhood. By that pond or right in the apartment. Yes. It was by the pond. You know, the one on the edge of the street where the fields begin. We were swimming together. He was particularly courteous and gentle, affectionate with me, giving me his hand and helping me down into the water. Caught me slipping. I do not even remember how it all happened. Only the baby squeak from the stroller brought me back from his embrace, but it was too late. I knew for the first time that a man can be so gentle and passionate at the same time, and I always lacked up with you. She was talking softly as if guessing my thoughts. To herself. She was sitting in her coat, disheveled by the autumn wind, and raindrops sparkled in her loose hair, as if washed with tears from head to toe, but she was not unhappy. And I was already looking at this woman in a new way. On one side, she was still my wife, on the other, a complete stranger, an unknown person whose life was unknown to me, and only accidentally the veil of mystery was revealed. She also looked very different. No. She was clearly not grief-stricken and depressed, on the contrary. Through the sparks of tears on her lashes, a cold, strong-willed look, and those eyes kept saying, "You did it all yourself. You alone are to blame for what happened. We were married too soon." Her 19 and my 20 having condensed us into a young family that hadn't had time to experience real life. The drab monotony of everyday life to personalize the days, and with the birth of a child, we became regular cogs in the family machinery of routine. We dissolved in the extraction of money, food, clothes. We stopped noticing each other's worlds. Yes. We were together. There was sex in the rare moments of free time, more like a compulsory ritual than a sincere pleasure, and it was not much different from brushing your teeth in the morning. Do you remember how you started to feel about me? And I remembered that 3 or 4 times in the last 7 years I had tried to break up my family. No. I had number 1 on the side. I sought solitude, quit my job and went to my hometown. I didn't like this city, its rhythm. I constantly blamed my discomfort on my wife, her overactive desire to marry me, and I did. I wanted to return to my former state, the one I had lived in before I got married, and I did not hide my desire from her. We met shortly before the army. I came to visit this town, saw her, and fell ill with her. A few days and nights we spent together. There was everything but sex. I fell in love with this girl with a huge auburn braid. She was 17 years old. Number 1 had ever cared about me like that in my youth. We wrote frequent letters, and she was waiting for me. I found out later that she had bought a wedding dress, but we hadn't even thought of getting married. But when she found out that I had realized my dream after 1 year service and had entered the military college, the letters came less often, and their content was condemning. And soon they stopped altogether. In her last letter, she blamed me for not thinking about her and for not wanting to wander around garrison and military outposts. In my studies, and did not think about anything else. A cadet in the army was not supposed to think about his personal life. The state and his father's commanders did it for him. And the time was already turbulent, the year 90 was going on. There were cracks in the system of the state, and even we, cadets, began to notice it. They began to let us go on leave with a sleepover. She arrived at the college suddenly, having traveled a few thousand kilometers with bags full of homemade delicacies. She stood waiting for me at the checkpoint. Worry. From the long journey and the weight of the heavy bags. I hadn't seen her for over a year, and I confess I didn't recognize her at once. They let me go on leave for 2 whole days, and we checked into a hotel. There was no crawling out of bed, caressing and kissing, but my frank consultant desire for more was repulsed by her. And I got nothing out of her. Yes. We were both virgins, and we still were. But she achieved her goal. She managed to convince me to quit school and come live with her. The homemade buns, pies, jam, stories about another wonderful life did their job. I decided to write my report about leaving military school. The intoxicating taste and warmth of a young woman's body kept my lips, eyes, fingers. It did not allow me to think about anything else, but returning to her as soon as possible. And now, we two strangers sitting and looking at each other, as if getting to know each other again, studying faces. Yes. My wife had cheated on me, and there was nothing I could do about it. And the devil made me